Boa tarde a todos. É um prazer estar aqui, convite do Clube de Lisboa, para este ciclo de conferências que hoje se inicia, subordinado ao tema Desafios Globais, as suas grandes tendências. Hoje vamos discutir os desafios globais relativos ao financiamento ao desenvolvimento, financiamento sustentável ao desenvolvimento. Quem quiser pode colocar perguntas, quer no canal do YouTube, quer no Facebook. E no fim, toda a conversa que teremos hoje aqui com o Olivier estará também disponível nas redes sociais do Clube de Lisboa. Eu vou mudar a nossa conversa para inglês, mas se tiverem algum interesse em colocar questões, também as podem colocar em português. Olivier, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. You are an expert on these financing for development questions. You are also a teacher at the Sciences Po University. It's really a pleasure to have this discussion with you. We went to Sevilla in July last year already, with a lot of hopes that we would manage to have a consensus about the next financing for development decade. Luckily, we managed to have some kind of consensus. There was a lot of enthusiasm and also a lot of initiatives, new initiatives put forward. We went to OCOSOC last April to make a little bit an assessment about where we were and what was developed since July last year. But I wanted to start by asking you, how do you see the future of financing for sustainable development? In your view, what are the main trends that we can observe today?
Mm-hmm.
Over to
you. Thank you. I will look at you in the screen so that I can also face your auditors. No, thank you for the kind invitation. At least the heat today in Paris reminds us of Sevilla. We thought last year we were reaching record, but we are still breaking them, which I think is also relevant to our discussion today. Because unfortunately, in terms of the trends, well, in 3 words, it's cuts. So this is something that hasn't happened in a long time, because ODA, official development assistance, was on the rise for many years. Last time it happened with cuts of such magnitude. We are talking about 1/3 of ODA that is being cut over 2 years. This was at the end of the Cold War, because official development assistance was very much linked to geopolitics and to supporting friendly countries. And when the Cold War was over, suddenly there was this existential crisis for ODA, and it took them about almost a decade, to come up with the concept of globalization, and that then had official development assistance pick up again. In terms of the trends, this is very important, because we are probably in a geopolitical situation very different from the end of the Cold War, but also, very difficult. And nowhere in the recent discussion that you have been attending also, Anna, I see that there is a new narrative that is emerging yet. We might discuss a little bit about some hints as to where it might head, but we don't have a common narrative yet, and we still have very much divergence among the different actors about what is the purpose of official development assistance today. So this is very important. Now, coming back to the question of the trends and the cuts. So I mentioned the volumes. This is huge. But I think beyond the volumes, what is also very important is who is most affected. And that's where I think where the main issue is. When you look at the LDCs and Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, they are the one most hit, 50% more than the rest of developing countries. So the poorest are again the one who are suffering the most. For multitude of reasons, because who cuts, like the US was doing mainly grants in Sub-Saharan Africa on health, for instance, and those countries depend on this income for their health policies. And so again, they are hit because of who cuts, because of the sectors that are cut, and because of the type of products, that are cut. Because that's the second, perspective beyond the volume and the qualitative dimension is the concessionality. Cuts of grants are 3 times larger than cuts of loans. And so again, the richest countries who tend to have more loans than grants are the one less hit, whereas those who depend on the grants are the one who has mostly 3 times more for that. Last point I want to make on those trends is probably that, unfortunately, we are not at the peak of the crisis. We should expect more cuts from those who have already cut. And I guess the OECD and others will do some projections as to what will be cut. Also, we saw last year that the projections were around the range was between 9 and 17%, and the actual cuts in last year were 23%. So it was more than anticipated. So there might be more cuts, but also what is important to understand is that for development finance institutions and the multilateral development banks in particular, like the World Bank and so on, because they do loans, they are still living off the business of the peak. So there will be a delay of 5 years before this comes down and it really hits. And so that will be very important to see how they address those changes, anticipate and change their business model to respond to the cuts.
Thank you, Olivier. I think it was very important that you set the scene also in terms of historical way, and also that we have a realistic perception about what is happening. So it's not the best scenario we would like to hear, but it's clear the most realistic that we can share. But that also, as you were mentioning also, will have to imply some trade-offs, because clearly if the trend will continue to be cuts on the volumes of ODA, and then we will speak more about other volumes also of private finance, but if the cuts are going to continue, then the members and the countries will need to take some prioritization. You already mentioned, which I think it's very important, this need for a new business model. But at the same time, what do you think will be those trade-offs? What trade-offs will be put in place to ensure that, the narrative around ODA might be a little bit more clear than it is, as you mentioned also today?
I see 2 major trade-offs. The first one is, to follow on what I was just discussing. The first trade-off, I think, is between leveraging and concessionality. What we hear a lot nowadays is that we need to do more with less. Indeed, it is possible to do more with less, because you have different type of instruments. I mentioned the difference between a loan and a grant, for instance. And so in the OECD, last multilateral development finance report, they had explored 3 different scenarios. The first one is you want to preserve the outflows. You are at the head of a development bank or an agency, and you say, okay, I want that the cuts affect as little as possible my outflows. What will I do? I will go where I can leverage private finance and do lots of loans with concessions that are stricter than what you would usually do. And then you manage to, absorb the shock, a little bit of the cuts. So that's one scenario. But of course, the consequence of this scenario is that you will have less for the least developed countries. And so that's the cost and the trade-off. The second way you could address, and you mentioned the word prioritization, that is very important. You can take a completely different approach and say, okay, we have cuts, we'll keep the little we have for the poorest. But that means that, of course, you will magnify the cuts in terms of the outflows, because you will have to do more of the most concessional. You won't be able to leverage with the private sector, and so on. So you start to see that that it's itchy for decision makers. I mean, what should I choose? Prioritization, leveraging, and so on. And at the end of the day, because you have been for a long time also in the multilateral system, you say that the temptation very often is when you cannot decide, you just do a haircut. You say, okay, I have 30% cut, I will cut everybody 30% without looking at, because it's so difficult to prioritize. And that's linked also to the UN80 reform and lots of things that are going on. But what happened, and there has been studies again in this report, I mean, that I mentioned from the OECD, that they look at the question of centrality of organizations. You have certain organizations like UNDP that are the center of the system. Everybody else in the system relies on them for the implementation of the program. So if you cut 30% at the center versus 30% at the margin, it has a completely different impact, because then you create bottlenecks at the implementation level, and then you have issues, and everybody suffers more. So those are very difficult from a political perspective to address these trade-offs, those decisions to make, and they will require political leadership. Because they are not easy. Another one, another major trade-off is this short-term versus long-term. Mm-hmm. It's also very much related, but you see in the recent history, in the past decade, the growth of ODA has been driven by crisis. It has been the refugee crisis, it has been the COVID crisis, it has been the Ukraine crisis. And you see that this has created the growth in ODA, when the rest of ODA remained largely flat. Mm-hmm. What we see today, however, is the cut not only of those that are being phased out, big time, for instance, for Ukraine because of the US and so on, COVID is down and so on. But what we see is that the cuts now start to affect the core ODA that remained more or less flat. So this has lots of implications because now it's more of a substitution rather than a top-on. Of course, this choice of addressing the crisis versus the long term as a cost, and all your colleagues working on fragility in particular will tell you it's always better to prevent the wars. It costs much less than to have to address the consequences of the wars, the displacement of populations, and so on. So if we go with such a short-term view, well, then we'll need to address the cost that will likely raise in the future. The second question is one of responsiveness. How, for instance, where the OECD Development Assistance Committee, what could be the role of the DAC in coordinating the responses to the crisis? So far, the DAC has only done evaluation a posteriori of how good they were at handling the crisis, but it never had really a role of saying, okay, we know next year we'll have a big crisis. How can we all together join forces to address this crisis? And another illustration of that, I think that interests everyone, is how the US is behaving today. The US, you see, at the same time has done massive cuts in the system, suppressed USAID and so on. And taking the example of the World Food Program, I think it was almost 75% cut in the World Food Program contribution. But then last week, they announced an 800 million contribution to the World Food Program. This is still much less than their usual. This is 4 times less than their usual contribution to the program. But it shows that there is now using development cooperation as a crisis response mechanism without investing in the core of the institution, but using them almost as a consultancy model. Was like, okay, we have a crisis here. Please beef up your staff, your resources, and move to the field. But that's a completely different business model that the UN and others are not built on. And so that will require, again, a complete readjustment of the system.
Thank you, Olivier. I think this is quite comprehensive. And again, the system you talked about, the DAC, which is the Development Assistance Committee, which has the so-called traditional donors as members, but we also have in the system southern providers, which have a different also way of doing, and they are still part of this big constellation of finance. And it's also very hard to compare what the southern providers, donors like China, Brazil, others are doing with the ones of the Development Assistance Committee, because also South-South cooperation is not measured in the same way, and it's not measured at all. There is now a pilot from UNCTAD that intends to start measuring in a more also completed way, what South-South is doing. There is also initiatives like the Total Official for Sustainable Development International Forum that tries to measure South-South, but it's not comparable, because there is much, the system, as you said, the business model is different. The business model of South-South is different. But besides South-South providers, we also have private sector, coming on board much more than before. And we also have foundations. Some foundations are providing more audible investment than some of the countries. So, how do you see all these new actors coming into the picture at the same time that FFT4, so Financing for Sustainable Development in Seville, was asking for a reform of the global architecture? So how the different pieces of the puzzle are going to juggle for us to get really what is needed, which is, financing for sustainable development, independently of the financing is ODA or not ODA. That sustainable development path is the commitment that we all did in 2015. And we know that we are lacking behind also because of the crisis, because of the war, but because also of this decreasing of investment on the core that you mentioned so well. So from your point of view, what can be the contribution of these different providers and stakeholders to this global architecture of financing?
No, thanks. That's not a piece of the puzzle. That's a puzzle in itself.
Yes, it will take us another 25 conversations here, but yes, I know we can.
If we first go, maybe, as you were asking the question, the first thing that came to mind is what happened at the G7. Last week also is because you mentioned ODA in the totality of flows, and that's one of the calls. That was sent by the G7 members to say, well, it's not enough to look at ODA. You need to look at all the other contributions to sustainable development, and I think that's something that is quite important. When you take one example that was given, of course, was with the French Development Agency, where they say the budget of AFD is 4.5 billion, but they mobilize a total of 14.5 billion. So that's a leverage we were talking about the other day. So I think it's important, and that includes, of course, the South-South, the triangular, and all the other flows, and also something that is important and linked to an issue that is on the lips of all the developing countries is also the question of the debt and debt sustainability. And it's not enough to look at the flows, the inflows in those countries, but also the outflows, and to look at the net of all those flows. So what is left in the country for their financing strategy? I think that's what really matters. And you're right that there is no interoperability yet of the data, and we need to work all together on that, be it international organizations. You mentioned the OECD, you mentioned UNCTAD, but also, civil society or other initiatives, like IATI and or even the Gates Foundation and so on, who are all working together to improve this picture. But now coming back to the architecture, and I think. For me, Sevilla was the last breath of the old world. You mentioned it in your introduction. We were all trying to rescue the multilateral system and to come to an agreement that will be palatable to all the UN members. And it was a success in that sense. But I think the Sevilla was also first glimpse into the new world because of what you mentioned, the Sevilla Platform for Action, which is basically there was a UN text for the UN members, but there was also this call on all other coalitions or actors who wanted to contribute to this common agenda. And this was the SPA with hundreds of initiatives that are on the platform. And what we saw is what Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada used in Davos a few months ago in January, February. He said we are living in a world of coalition, and I think the SPA and Sevilla was the first impersonation of this world of coalition. And there, what is interesting is that until then, everybody was only looking at the OECD DAC because it was the only existing coalition, basically. So it was always in the eye of Sauron. And many people thought that the DAC was setting the rules for the whole world. The DAC is setting the rules only for OECD members, but it happened to be the only coalition. Now we have a plethora of coalitions that came up. Well, the one I think that succeeded most was the Finance in Common, with all the public development banks that came together. They managed to be in the declaration everywhere, so they managed to organize themselves as a coalition and network for action. Another one also, that existed at OECD is also on Net Forward on the philanthropies that also try to organize themselves, and we see that for the first time we had a F7, a philanthropy 7, on the margins of the French presidency of the G7, and we saw very recently also an adoption of a sort of a DAC competitor for countries from the south with a coalition of governments on global public investment. When you look at the description of this coalition, it's very much reminiscent of the role of the DAC for OECD countries, but this for emerging countries. So my question now is, this is great, because that means the DAC is not the only one, but my question is how to make sure that this does not add to the main problem of architecture today, that is fragmentation. How to ensure that those coalitions are a stepping stone and not a stumbling block, as we say in English, for the multilateral system. And so you don't want to add another layer of complexity, but you know that at the moment, because of fragmentation, that's yet closer to the multilateralism. And so that's something that will need to be handled in the coming years. And I think it will be challenging because the DAC has 60 years of practice of trying to organize standards, best practices, and so on, or data for its members. But I think this level of accountability will need to be applied to all the other coalitions. I give you just one example of the philanthropies. Gates Foundation now is the largest contributor to the budget of World Health Organization, of the WHO. Because the replenishment of Gavi was not as successful as predicted, Gates now is the largest contributor to Gavi, and Gavi is the third largest contributor to the WHO. So you have one philanthropical organization that is at the same time number 1 and number 3 in terms of contribution to the WHO. And can it be then decided, of the strategy of Gates and so on, or only of the will of the owner? That's his money. People will say he spends it the way he wants. But that's also now is ruling the WHO. And so, and same, does he have to publish all his accounts the same way the members do it at OECD and or at UNCTAD and so on? That's a question. So we are really in this situation in terms of architecture where we are at the beginning again of something that hasn't crystallized yet into a fully satisfactory and well functioning model.
But it's true. I think that's a very important point, which is who rules the system after, and what is the tendency that we are seeing? What is the trend that we are seeing in terms of who are the main stakeholders? And the accountability mechanisms are not eventually so developed for countries as they are developed not so developed for private sector and foundations as they are developed for countries, as you were saying. So I want to focus a little bit more on private sector, Olivier, because I think it's also always these dynamics, and tension that exists. And again, it goes back to our initial part of the conversation, the initial part of this conversation, which is prioritization. There is a tension between, providing support to civil society or leveraging ODA by providing support to private sector. There is also this tension saying, we cannot just with ODA solve the problem of the financing gap. We have 4 trillion now that is needed or more. So clearly, public money is not going to be enough. So that's another tension in this, sustainable for development thing. Then there is also this question about the good private sector, the bad private sector, and all that other tension, which it's very much linked with the responsible business conduct discipline, if you want, but still, it's not an accountability mechanism. It's more a assessment of who is the good and who is the bad, not necessarily the accountability. And then to add to this confusion, and I hope people that are listening to us are not confused and they didn't give up to listen to us, and we would like very much to get your questions also, but to add to this complexity, I would say, there is also the question about impact, because still we have a deficit of having the capacity to show how can we achieve impact. And would private sector help us? Because they are more business-oriented, more impacted-oriented to their clients, if I want, help us achieving that impact, or they will be more a problem than a solution. And also, of course, we know that now private sector is not the panacea to everything, because private sector is not going to engage in fragile countries or in conflicts or in areas where clearly the risk is too high. So I don't want the people listening to us to think that, I'm putting this as the private sector is not going to be the panacea for everything. It's not the case. We know it's not the case. But how can we, again, put this piece together with the other ones and ensuring that we address the risks, but we continue to focus on impact? So again, over to you.
Thank
For
you.
another simple question.
Another easy one. Okay, thank you. But no, I mean, well, just to say, it's since the 2009 crisis I've been teaching. You mentioned, at the beginning, the role of private sector in financing sustainable development. So I'm a firm believer in the role of the private sector for development. And as you often say, if you want someone not to take a gun, give him a job. And I think job creation is the most important. That's what the private sector does. And also that's something that is very important. We should not confuse the roles. The role of the private sector is to make profit and to create jobs and so on. That's a virtue of the thing. When you look at the numbers, because you mentioned the SDG financing gap, somewhere between 4 and 6, because it keeps increasing, $1 trillion at the moment. Assets under management in the world, are above 500, around 500 trillion, and that's only the tip of the iceberg, because we don't know what's all the illicit financial flows and all the rest that happen. Something I always do in my class, and I update, is to compare the benefit of the 10 most profitable companies in the world with ODA, and it's 3 times larger. So 10 companies, their benefits, the total is 3 times larger than ODA. That gives you an idea of,
how much public money is going to one thing than to the other.
Yes, so that's very important. And I think also because the private sector is so broad, we tend to confuse things. There is business, that is one thing. There is investors, that's another thing. And there is a philanthropy we already mentioned. When I talk about business and operation of business in developing countries and how they can contribute to the SDGs and so on, I have 2 basic rules. The first one, as an economist, I always think that if there is a market, the private sector will go.
Yeah.
If there is no market and the private sector goes, then you start to worry because that means you have created enough distortions in the market to make it interesting for them to go. But then their market is the subsidies or is whatever you do to
it's not the real market.
It's not the real market. And I must admit, a bit shocked. I mean, when I was with the Global Investors for Sustainable Development, when they were speaking at the FFD Forum in New York, and the representative was saying, probably well-meaning, say, well, give us $130 billion and we will go. That's the total amount almost of ODA. And if we need to subsidize them just to go and to do also, as you said, they cannot do everything. They won't go to the poorest. They won't do the capacity building, I mean, institutional capacity building and so on, where the impact is not as easy to measure. So that's the thing. So the billion to trillions agenda was created more than 10 years ago, and we are still today, I think the latest data is around $14.5 billion dollars of private finance mobilized by ODA. So we are still very far away from it. But again, because this is very niche, and we shouldn't fool people and say that promise that through blending we'll suddenly have the trillions that will flow, unless you give so much in subsidies that then it becomes. But then it's is it a good use of public money, and do you create diversion? That's the issue from an economist point of view. The second thing, and that's what I'm always trying to look for in my research, is the convergence of public and private interest. And I think that's where there is hope, because again, it's not about private business becoming philanthropies and so on, but they need to do profit. But sometimes by doing things good, you also do more profit. And there are three cases in particular where that happens. The first one is on sourcing. You're Nestle, you need cocoa. So you need farmers who stay in the country, don't move to the cities. You need young people to be interested and so on. So you need to train them to give more income and so on. So this is the first convergence. I mean, the second one is when you create markets. If you are a credit card company, I mean, and it happens that reducing the access to finance gap is also in your interest, because you will have more customer, and then you can work together with them, or with Google deploying cables, because that's necessary to access their product later. And then the third one, which is more niche, is is like in fair trade and those brands like Veja and so on that are building their business model around sustainability. So those are the things where I do firmly believe there are solutions, but we need this convergence. If there is no convergence of public and private interest, I mean, it's lost in my view. And same for investors. I think we did also some work. I mean, with UNDP, OECD at the previous French presidency on the G7 on trying to align investment with the SDGs, and that should not happen. We always think on what developing countries should do. But the changes need also to occur in OECD countries to create the right incentives to invest in the poorest country. Just to give you one example of a discussion with BlackRock, where they were saying, I can be 100% aligned with the SDGs by investing it all in social housing in Germany. Great. That's SDG aligned, but it won't solve the issue of development.
Exactly. So. But I'm conscious of the time, Olivier, and I think we need to close here. But we have just, we have several questions here, but I will pick just one, because I think we didn't spoke about it enough, which is, what is the role of civil society in the middle of all this? There is a question related to that. So very briefly, from your point of view, we have the private sector. It's a trend. Everyone is paying attention to that. We have the foundations. It's clearly there, and it's assuming more and more importance. So what is left, if I may put it like that? How do you see the role of civil society also in this big picture of financing for sustainable development? And then we will try to wrap up immediately after your intervention, unless you want to share a last message
I will
from you
conclude
too.
with the CSO, because I think that's very important. And again, I mean, the CSO is very diversified, and we need to think of CSO locally also, and not only OECD countries and so on, and that's important. But I mentioned this change in architecture, and CSOs. And there has been for a long time a dialogue, I mean, of the CSOs with the DAC at OECD and so on. But CSOs really are the watchdog of the system. They are the one who will be able to hold all the actors accountable for what they do. And that applies to the old institutional ones, but also the emerging ones. And I think that's also a challenge, because they need to get organized also to monitor what the emerging countries will be doing, what the philanthropies will be doing. And sometimes it's a much harder task, because they don't even have a space or somewhere where they can put their ideas forward. So the UN, obviously, and the FFD Forum and the Development Cooperation Forum and so on are a space, I mean, for the CSO. But that's not enough. It should happen and hit the ground, I mean, in wherever different actors operate.
Great. I think I want to start by thanking you, Olivier. I think this was a good first discussion of the 5 that we're going to have, to set the scene, and also to, put us in thinking about the future, not just about the past, which is also very important. And as you said, I wanted just to pick up 3 words: coalition, impact, and fragmentation. And in the middle of these 3, we will have to find our way through clearly. So I'm going to move now to Portuguese, if you don't mind. Just to, para dizer muito obrigada a todos os que nos ouviram, quer no YouTube, quer no Facebook. Dizer que podem acompanhar ou rever esta conversa também nas redes sociais do Clube de Lisboa, e cá estaremos para a próxima conversa muito em breve. Portanto, as we say in English, stay tuned and hope to see you again. Até breve.
Thank you. Bye-bye.